In March of 1840, inside a candlelit auction house on St. Louis Street in New Orleans, something happened that terrified even the men who made their living buying human beings. A single enslaved woman, her name deliberately omitted from the ledger, was placed on the block. Within minutes, the bidding spiraled out of control. 7 of the wealthiest white men in Louisiana entered a war of money and pride, pushing her price higher than any female slave ever recorded in the city. By sunset, the final bid crossed a number no woman had ever fetched before. But that was only the beginning. Before the week ended, 3 of those bidders would be dead, one from a fall no one could explain, one from an illness that came too fast, and one whose body was never found at all. By the end of the year, 5 plantations connected to that auction would burn, 2 powerful families would quietly vanish from Louisiana society, and every official record of the woman herself would disappear. White New Orleans whispered that she was cursed. Others said she was protected. But none of them understood the truth. They did not know what she carried inside her memory, or what she had already survived. And they certainly did not know what she was about to do. Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your state below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. New Orleans in the spring of 1840 did not wake gently. It sweated itself conscious. The Mississippi lay swollen and brown beneath a sky already thick with heat, its surface carrying sugar barrels, cotton bales, and the quiet bones of things that never reached shore. The air smelled of river rot and molasses, of horse dung and boiled coffee, of perfume failing to disguise decay. Church bells rang from St. Louis Cathedral each morning, their solemn notes floating over streets where chains clinked in answer, as if the city itself were answering prayer with iron. It was a city built to sell. On St. Louis Street, just steps from the grand square where white men debated philosophy and liberty, the auction houses stood like respectable storefronts. Their windows were scrubbed clean. Their ledgers were kept neat. Inside, human lives were weighed with the same care given to tobacco leaf and cane yield. Prices rose and fell. Teeth were inspected. Backs were prodded. Names were erased. No one called it cruelty. They called it commerce. What most visitors never understood was that New Orleans did not merely traffic in bodies. It trafficked in secrets. Some were whispered in French behind lace fans. Others were locked inside strong boxes, hidden beneath false bottoms and polite smiles. And some walked openly through the streets, unnoticed until it was too late. The woman would arrive in the city 2 days before the auction, brought in at dawn through the river gate where the fog still clung low and thick. She stepped onto the cobblestones barefoot, her dress too thin for modesty and too clean for coincidence. A short chain bound her wrists, not because she struggled, but because the men escorting her felt safer that way. She did not look around as they walked her through the quarter. She did not stare at the balconies dripping with iron lace, or the women watching from behind shutters. She did not flinch at the sound of a cart wheel snapping against stone. She kept her eyes forward, her posture straight, her breathing steady. It unsettled the guards. Most enslaved people arrived in New Orleans hollowed out by the journey. Their shoulders slumped. Their eyes darted. Their fear leaked from them like sweat. This woman carried hers differently. It stayed inside her, contained, pressed flat and sharp as a folded blade. None of the men walking beside her knew her full history. They had been told only what mattered for sale. That she was young enough to bear children. That she had worked both field and house. That she spoke clearly and learned quickly. That she had never been whipped for disobedience. That last detail had been added in ink darker than the rest. She was lodged overnight in a holding pen behind the auction house, a narrow room with barred windows and a dirt floor beaten hard by other feet. The woman sat against the wall, knees drawn close, listening to the city breathe. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed too loudly. Somewhere else, a woman cried until her voice failed. Rats moved inside the walls. Above her, in an office with polished wood and clean hands, a clerk prepared the next day's catalog. He sharpened his pen, dipped it carefully, and paused over one blank line longer than necessary. Name, the form read. He hesitated. In the end, he wrote nothing. The omission would later be called a clerical error. A smudge. A lost note. Historians would argue that names went missing all the time in those ledgers. Meant nothing. But omissions, like silences, often meant more than words. The morning of the auction rose heavy and bright. By midday, the rotunda was full. Plantation owners arrived in linen suits already damp with sweat. Brokers leaned against pillars, murmuring calculations. A judge from upriver took a seat near the front, his expression carefully neutral. A widow in mourning black sat with her chin lifted, her eyes sharp. Several men nodded to one another without smiling. They had all come for the same reason. Rumors had a way of moving faster than official notices. Word had spread of a woman with an unusual composure, with skills that could not be easily itemized. Some said she read. Others said she healed. A few claimed she remembered everything she heard, word for word. No one could say where the story started. No one could say who benefited from them. What none of the bidders knew was that the woman already recognized the room. Not the faces exactly. The patterns. She understood the way men leaned forward when they wanted something badly. The way they pretended not to care. She recognized the smell of ambition beneath cologne. She had learned, long before New Orleans, that men who believed themselves powerful were often the easiest to predict. When they finally brought her onto the platform, the room stilled. The auctioneer cleared his throat. He glanced at the paper in his hand. For the briefest moment, confusion flickered across his face. Then he smiled and raised his voice. Lot number. He stopped. Adjusted. A fine female. Exceptional condition. A ripple of interest moved through the crowd. The woman lifted her head. Her eyes swept the room once, slowly, deliberately. Several men felt the peculiar sensation of being measured. One of them shifted uncomfortably. Another smiled despite himself. None of them knew that this moment, this single, suspended breath, was the last time the auction would feel like a simple transaction. Because by nightfall, money would turn into fear. And fear in New Orleans had a way of spreading like fire. The auctioneer began low, as if testing the water. A reasonable opening figure. Say, polite. The kind of number that suggested routine. A few men nodded. One hand lifted. Then another. The rhythm settled briefly into something familiar, the steady rise of value measured in dollars and breath. Then the first interruption came. A voice from the left side of the room, calm and confident, cut through the cadence and doubled the bid. Murmurs followed. Heads turned. The auctioneer blinked once, then adjusted, his voice lifting to meet the new number. He had seen enthusiasm before. This felt different. This felt like provocation. The woman remained still. She stood with her hands folded loosely before her, chin level, eyes unfocused in a way that suggested patience rather than fear. The crowd studied her more closely now. Someone noticed the lack of scars on her wrists. Someone else remarked, sotto voce, on her posture. A man in the second row leaned forward, squinting as if trying to solve a puzzle that refused to arrange itself. Another bid came. Higher. Then another. Faster. The room warmed with excitement. Money had always stirred men like blood in water, but this was not greed alone. Pride entered the exchange, then rivalry. A sugar planter from Plaquemines Parish smiled thinly as he raised the price again, his eyes fixed not on the woman but on the judge seated across from him. You will not outbid me today, that look said. The judge lifted his hand without expression. The number climbed. Conversations died. Even the auctioneer began to sweat in earnest, his voice sharpening, the practiced chant slipping as he struggled to keep pace. He glanced down at the ledger again, his brow creasing. There was still no name to anchor the rising sum. Just a body. Just potential. What the bidders did not know was that the woman had already decided something important. She had learned, over years of being watched, how to appear empty. How to make men project onto her what they wanted most. Obedience. Gratitude. Silence. She had survived by understanding that attention, properly managed, could be turned into cover. She let them look. A man near the back whispered to his companion, "She does not tremble." His companion replied, "That will pass." It would not. The widow entered the contest next. Her gloved hand rose delicately, the motion precise. She did not glance at the others. Her bid was strategic, placed exactly where it would sting. Several men stiffened. One scoffed aloud. The sugar planter laughed, though his eyes hardened. The auctioneer called the next figure. It was already an absurd sum. He had never sold a woman at this level. He had never sold anything at this level without months of rumor and display. This was happening too fast. A hush fell when the quiet man finally spoke. He had not bid once. He had stood against a column near the wall, hat in hand, his face unreadable. When his voice entered the room, it did not rise. It did not strain. It simply claimed space. A number was named. Several people gasped. The judge swore under his breath. The widow's lips pressed together, her composure cracking for the first time. This was no longer business. This was challenge. The woman shifted her weight slightly. The chain at her wrists made a soft sound. She met the quiet man's eyes. For a fraction of a second, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. or calculation. He looked away first. What none of them knew was that the quiet man had been searching for her long before that day, that he had followed rumors downriver, that he had paid for information no ledger recorded, that he believed she carried something that did not belong to him, something he intended to reclaim. The bidding resumed, reckless now. Each raise felt like a blow. Men who had sworn limits to themselves crossed them without hesitation. Fortunes were dented. Alliances fractured. The auctioneer's voice grew hoarse. Sweat darkened his collar. He could no longer hide his astonishment. When the final bid was called, the room did not erupt. It fell silent. The number hung in the air, obscene in its excess. No one spoke. The auctioneer swallowed. He lifted his gavel, hesitated, then brought it down with a sharp crack that echoed against the rotunda's walls. Sold. The word landed like a verdict. The woman did not react. She did not bow her head. She did not cry. She looked instead toward the windows where sunlight spilled in, bright and unforgiving. Somewhere in the city, a bell rang. By nightfall, one of the men who had bid would not return home, and the true cost of that sale would begin to reveal itself. They did not applaud. Applause was reserved for theaters and sermons, for moments when men wished to be seen approving of something. This required no approval. The transaction had concluded. That was enough. The auctioneer exhaled slowly and wiped his brow with a linen handkerchief already soaked through. He signaled to the clerk, who dipped his pen and wrote the final figure with deliberate care. The ink bled slightly into the page as if even the paper resisted accepting what had just been done. Ownership had changed hands. The buyer stepped forward at last. Up close he was unremarkable. Middle-aged, well-fed, dressed in quality cloth that announced wealth without shouting it. His face bore the mild redness of a man accustomed to authority and warm rooms. He did not look at the woman immediately. He produced his papers first, his movements efficient, practiced. This was not his first purchase, nor his largest. It was simply the most visible. When he finally turned to her, his gaze lingered. "You will come with me." The words were not a question. She inclined her head slightly. The smallest possible acknowledgement. He mistook it for submission. Most men did. As arrangements were made, the crowd began to thin. Conversations resumed in low, urgent tones. Numbers were repeated with disbelief. Some laughed, sharp and brittle. Others avoided one another's eyes entirely. More than one man wondered, privately, whether he had just lost something that could not be replaced. The widow stood as the room emptied, her gloved fingers tightening around her reticule. She watched the woman closely now, studying her as one might study a chessboard after an unexpected loss. "Do you know what you have bought?" she asked quietly, not addressing the buyer so much as the idea of him. He smiled. "I know exactly what I have paid." She did not smile back. The transfer was scheduled for that evening. The buyer did not wish to draw attention by removing her immediately, not with so many eyes still alert. Appearances mattered in New Orleans. Discretion often disguised cruelty more effectively than chains. The woman was led back to the holding area beneath the auction house. The chain was removed. The door closed. A guard was posted outside, instructed to watch and listen. Inside, she sat on the bench and folded her hands in her lap. Her breathing remained steady. The space smelled of old sweat and damp stone. A thin strip of light cut across the floor through a high window. What the guard did not know was that she had already memorized the rhythm of his steps. The way he shifted his weight when bored. The way he hummed when anxious. She had learned long ago that men revealed themselves in their habits long before they revealed their intentions. Above her, in an office that overlooked the street, the buyer met with a lawyer to finalize documents. They spoke of clauses and contingencies, of transport and discretion. "She is valuable," the lawyer said carefully. "Such purchases invite attention." "I will manage it," the buyer replied. "I always do." The lawyer hesitated. There were irregularities. What kind? The lack of origin. No clear chain of sale. No plantation mark. The buyer dismissed this with a wave. "Every asset begins somewhere. It is enough that she ends with me." What he did not know was that the absence of marks was not accidental. That her last owner had burned his own records in a panic, watching the flames consume names and dates that no longer felt safe to keep. The guard outside the holding room shifted. He glanced at the door, then away. He had been told she was dangerous only in the abstract sense that all enslaved people were considered dangerous if left unattended. He saw no reason for concern. Inside, the woman closed her eyes briefly. She did not pray. She counted. She counted the seconds between footsteps. the distance from the bench to the door, the sound of carts passing in the street above. She replayed the faces she had seen that day, cataloging them, attaching memories to names she did not yet know. One face in particular returned to her thoughts. The quiet man. He had left without a word after the sale, slipping out before the others. He had not looked back. That worried her more than the anger of those who had lost. Because men who made no display often carried the longest intentions. As dusk approached, the buyer returned with 2 escorts. He stood in the doorway, blocking the light, his shadow stretching toward her feet. It is time. She rose smoothly. There was no hesitation in her movements. One of the escorts reached for her arm. She did not resist, but she did look at him. His hand faltered. The buyer noticed. He frowned, then laughed softly. You see? Already she understands. They led her out into the street, where the city was shifting into its evening skin. Lanterns flickered to life. Music drifted from somewhere distant. The Mississippi breathed heavily in the dark. The carriage waited. As she stepped inside, unseen by the men around her, the woman pressed her thumb against the inside of her wrist, feeling the faint ridge of an old scar. It reminded her of a promise she had made to herself years earlier. By the time the carriage door closed, that promise was already beginning to collect interest. The carriage moved without haste, its wheels rattling softly over stone as if the city itself were trying not to draw attention to what traveled through it. Curtains were drawn, though there was little to see beyond flickering lamplight and the occasional silhouette crossing an intersection. Inside, the woman sat upright, hands folded, eyes forward. The buyer sat opposite her, one leg crossed, studying her in the measured way of a man assessing a possession he could not yet fully inventory. You understand English well enough, he said. She did not answer immediately. Silence, she had learned, unsettled men more effectively than defiance. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, uninflected. Yes, sir. Good. He nodded to himself. You will find my household orderly. I value obedience and discretion above all else. The words were practiced. He had delivered some version of them before, to others who had not survived him. He did not know that she was already mapping his weaknesses, the slight tremor in his left hand, the impatience beneath his composure, the way his eyes flicked toward the door whenever the carriage slowed. They arrived at his townhouse just as the street lamps reached full brightness. The building stood narrow and tall, its brick facade freshly scrubbed, its ironwork polished to a dull gleam. Inside, the air smelled of wax and starch. A woman appeared in the doorway, older, tightly laced, her expression fixed into permanent vigilance. This is her, the buyer said. See that she is fed and kept clean. She will remain here tonight. The housekeeper's eyes flicked over the woman quickly, efficiently. She said nothing, but something tightened in her mouth. The woman was shown to a small room at the back of the house. It held a cot, a basin, and a single narrow window that looked onto an alley. The door closed with a soft click. There was no lock on the inside. Above her, in the main parlor, the buyer poured himself a drink and sank into a chair. The events of the day replayed in his mind, each number, each look from the crowd. Satisfaction warred with irritation. He had paid too much. Everyone would say so. He told himself it did not matter. He could afford excess. Excess was proof. What he did not know was that his housekeeper had recognized the woman. Not by name. By stillness. She had seen it once before years ago in a girl brought in from upriver who had lasted barely a month. That girl had watched everything. That girl had smiled once just before the fire. Downstairs, the woman washed her hands slowly, carefully, as if the act itself were ceremonial. She ate the bread left for her without hurry. When she lay down on the cot, she did not sleep. She listened. The house settled. Footsteps passed overhead. Somewhere, glass clinked. The buyer laughed at something said by someone unseen. The sound carried down the narrow halls and faded. Near midnight, there was a knock at the front door. The buyer answered it himself, irritation already sharpening his features. A man stood on the threshold, hat in hand, his expression apologetic. Pardon the hour. There has been an incident. The buyer stiffened. What kind of incident? Mr. LeBlanc. From the auction. The name landed heavily. One of the bidders. A man with too much temper and not enough caution. What about him? The visitor hesitated. He is dead. The buyer's grip tightened on the doorframe. Dead? They found him at the foot of the stairs in his townhouse. Neck broken. The servants swear he was alone. Silence stretched. The buyer forced a laugh. Drunk men fall every day in this city. Yes, sir, the visitor agreed quickly. Of course. Still, given the day, some are whispering. Let them, the buyer snapped. Coincidence invites fools. The visitor nodded and took his leave. The buyer closed the door and stood there, unmoving. A chill crept up his spine, unwelcome and irrational. He finished his drink in one swallow and told himself again that the city was full of accidents. Down the hall, the woman opened her eyes. She had not heard the words. She had heard the pause. The way the buyer's voice changed. She understood the weight of certain silences. By morning, the news would spread. By afternoon, another man would fall ill. By nightfall, the buyer would begin to wonder whether ownership was ever as simple as paper declared. And somewhere in the city, the quiet man would be listening, waiting for the moment when waiting was no longer necessary. By morning, New Orleans had already decided what it wanted the death to mean. Mr. LeBlanc had been known for his appetite. For drink, for women, for risk. A fall suited him. The explanation traveled easily from kitchen to carriage, from dockside tavern to breakfast table. Men nodded as if the city itself had shrugged. The buyer nodded too. He dressed carefully that day, choosing a darker coat than usual, one that made him feel composed. He took breakfast in silence while the housekeeper moved about the room, her eyes lowered, her steps measured. When he finished, he wiped his mouth and stood. "Bring her," he said. The woman entered the parlor a moment later. The housekeeper kept a careful distance, as if proximity itself might invite consequence. "You will accompany me this morning," the buyer said. "There are matters to attend." "Yes, sir." He watched her closely for a reaction that never came. No widening of the eyes. No tightening of the mouth. Only calm attention. It irritated him more than open resistance would have. They walked instead of taking the carriage, the buyer eager to be seen, eager to show that nothing had changed. The city greeted them with its usual indifference. Merchants shouted prices. A child darted between carts. Somewhere, a piano stumbled through a melody it would never quite master. As they passed a bookseller's stall, the buyer slowed. "You read?" he asked suddenly. "Yes, sir." "What languages?" "English, French, some Spanish." The answer was delivered without pride, without apology. He stopped walking, turned to her, studied her as if seeing her for the first time. That was not listed. She met his gaze. Many things are not listed. A dangerous sentence. He felt it at once. His jaw tightened. "Be careful." She inclined her head. "Yes, sir." They continued on, but something had shifted. He could feel it, like a seam pulled too hard. In an office near the river, a clerk dipped his pen and frowned at a ledger that refused to make sense. He traced lines with his finger, following transactions backward. Names appeared, disappeared. Dates overlapped in ways they should not have. One entry in particular troubled him. A sale recorded in Natchez 3 years earlier. A woman sold without description beyond female, capable. The buyer listed had died 6 months later. Fever officially. The clerk made a note in the margin, then crossed it out. Curiosity was expensive. Back at the townhouse, the buyer dismissed the woman to her room and sat with his lawyer once more. "I want clarity," he said. "I do not like surprises." The lawyer adjusted his spectacles. "There is nothing to clarify. The sale was legal. And the deaths. The city is full of them." The buyer leaned forward. "You are avoiding the question." The lawyer hesitated. "There are rumors." "Of what?" "That she brings misfortune." The buyer laughed sharply. "Superstition." "Of course," the lawyer agreed. "Still, I would advise caution." The buyer waved him away. He refused to allow unease to settle. Unease suggested weakness. That afternoon, word arrived that the judge who had bid so aggressively at the auction had taken to his bed. Sudden fever. Delirium. His family sent for a doctor, then another. The buyer heard the news from a neighbor who spoke too quickly, too brightly. "Pure chance," the buyer said. "Yes," the neighbor replied, though he did not sound convinced. That evening, the buyer drank alone. He watched the shadows climb the walls. When he finally summoned the woman, his voice was harsher than he intended. "Do you know what people are saying about you?" She stood before him, hands folded. "People say many things. They say men who wanted you are dying." Pause. Measured. "Men die every day." He stepped closer. "Do not play games." She lifted her eyes then, meeting his fully. For the first time, something flickered there. Not fear. Recognition. "I do not need to play," she said softly. The buyer felt a chill. He told himself it was imagination. That power rested where it always had. Above them in the attic, rats scurried through dust and forgotten trunks. One of those trunks held a small bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth, left behind by a previous owner who had never returned to claim them. Names were written there. Dates. Routes. Proof of things no one wanted remembered. None of them knew that the woman already knew what was inside that trunk. She had seen papers like it before. She had survived them. And now, with each whispered death, the city was beginning to understand that some accounts, once opened, could never be balanced again. The buyer slept poorly that night. When sleep came at all, it arrived in fragments, images without order, voices without faces. He dreamed of ledgers that would not close, pages swelling and splitting as if soaked through with water. He woke before dawn with the taste of iron in his mouth and an unshakable sense that something had already moved beyond his reach. Downstairs, the housekeeper had risen earlier still. She lit the kitchen fire and set about her tasks with deliberate calm, though her hands trembled when she thought no one watched. She had seen the way the buyer looked at the woman now, the irritation sharpened into something like apprehension. Men like him did not fear easily. When they did, they grew cruel. The woman was awake when summoned. She had not slept. She never slept deeply in new places. Too many rooms had taught her that rest was a luxury claimed only after escape. "You will tell me where you came from," the buyer said once they were alone. He stood near the window, the pale morning light outlining his shoulders. "I require a complete account." She waited a moment before answering, as if searching for the right place to begin. "I came from north of here." "That is not an account." "I was born farther still." He turned sharply. "Do not test my patience." She met his gaze without flinching. Patience has never been the problem. The audacity of it struck him like a slap. His hand twitched at his side. For a moment, he imagined striking her simply to restore the balance he felt slipping. The impulse frightened him more than it angered him. "You forget yourself," he said. "No, sir," she replied. "I remember myself." The words lingered between them. He took a step back as if the space itself had grown hostile. Later that morning, he rode out to visit the judge's home, driven less by concern than by the need to see with his own eyes that the world still behaved as it should. The house was closed up tight. Black crepe had already been draped across the door. The judge was dead. The buyer felt the news settle into him like cold stone. 2 men now. 2 bidders. Both gone within days of the auction. Coincidence began to strain under its own weight. When he returned home, he found his lawyer waiting, his expression grave. "This cannot continue," the buyer said before the man could speak. "I want this resolved." The lawyer lowered his voice. "There is something else. A rumor from the docks. A man claims she was seen before years ago, in Natchez. Connected to a fire." The buyer's jaw tightened. "Stories." "Yes," the lawyer agreed. "But stories persist." They spoke then of contingencies, of relocation, of selling quietly, downriver or abroad, before attention grew sharper. The buyer listened, nodding, but his mind kept returning to the woman's eyes, to the way she had spoken as if ownership were a temporary inconvenience. That evening, the buyer ordered her brought to him again. This time, he dismissed the servants entirely. "You will answer me plainly," he said, "if you wish to avoid consequences." She regarded him steadily. "Consequences arrive whether one wishes or not." "Enough," he snapped. "I paid for you. That gives me the right." "To command," she finished, "not to understand." The interruption stunned him. He felt his temper flare, hot and immediate. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You belong to me." She did not move. No. The word was quiet. Absolute. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt charged, as if a storm pressed close to breaking. Somewhere in the house wood creaked as it cooled. "You will regret this," he said finally. She inclined her head. "So have others." He struck her then, not hard, not with full force. A reflex. An attempt to reclaim something slipping away. The sound echoed sharply in the room. She staggered only slightly. When she straightened, her expression had changed. The calm remained, but something beneath it had hardened. Outside, a carriage passed, wheels rattling over stone. By morning, the buyer would begin making arrangements to remove her from the city. By morning, another man connected to the auction would be missing. And by the time the buyer understood that contracts bound only those who believed in them, the woman would already be counting distances again. This time, not to the door, but to the river. The buyer sent word before dawn. Quiet word. Careful word. The kind that traveled through kitchens and stables instead of offices. By noon, Arrangements were in motion to move the woman south along the river, away from New Orleans, away from curiosity. He told himself this was prudence, not fear. Men like him preferred that distinction. She leaves tonight, he told the lawyer. No announcement. No delay. The lawyer hesitated. At night. Before another rumor grows legs. What the buyer did not know was that the river already knew her. The woman learned of the plan from the housekeeper, who spoke while polishing silver, her back turned. They will take you after supper, she murmured. 2 men. A skiff waiting near the wharf. The woman nodded once. Thank you. The housekeeper paused, then added, barely audible, I will forget your face. That is kind, the woman said, but unnecessary. By dusk, the city had thickened into shadow. Lanterns burned low along the levee. The Mississippi moved slow and wide, carrying secrets in its silt. Barges creaked. Voices drifted, softened by distance and drink. They brought her out through the back door, wrists bound again, a hood drawn loosely over her hair. The buyer did not accompany them. He watched from an upstairs window, a single candle behind him, his reflection faint in the glass. For a moment he considered calling the whole thing off. For a moment he imagined that doing nothing might still save him. He closed the curtain. The men escorting her spoke little. One was young, eager, still convinced that rules protected him. The other walked with the confidence of habit, his hand never straying far from the knife at his belt. Move, the older one said. She moved. They reached the wharf without incident. The skiff waited, tied loosely, rocking gently against the posts. Beyond it, the river stretched dark and endless. As the older man stepped forward to untie the rope, the woman shifted her weight. It happened quickly. She drove her elbow backward into the younger man's throat, precise, practiced. His grip loosened with a startled sound. Before the older man could turn fully, she wrenched free and pushed him hard. He stumbled, caught himself, swore. Get her. She did not run. She moved sideways toward the water, using the darkness as cover. The younger man collapsed to his knees, gasping. The older lunged, fingers grazing fabric. The woman grabbed the skiff's rope and pulled. The boat lurched. The older man lost his footing. There was a sharp crack as his head struck the post. He went into the river without a sound. The water swallowed him whole. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The younger man stared, horrified, torn between pursuit and survival. The woman did not wait for him to decide. She pushed the skiff free, vaulted inside, and took the oar. Stop, the younger man shouted, his voice cracking. She did not look back. The current caught the skiff at once, tugging it downstream. She worked the oar with controlled strokes, guiding rather than fighting the flow. Years ago, on another river, she had learned that lesson the hard way. Behind her, the wharf dissolved into darkness. The city receded, its lights blurring, its grip loosening. By the time the alarm was raised, the river had already claimed another story. The buyer learned of the escape near midnight. A servant knocked, breathless, eyes wide. She is gone. The buyer stood very still. What do you mean gone? One man is missing. The other says she took the boat. The buyer felt something inside him give way, not panic, not yet, but certainty. He knew then that the city would not protect him. That ownership, once challenged, was never as solid as it pretended to be. At dawn, the body of the older man washed up several miles downriver. The official report called it an accident. Drunken misstep. Poor footing. By then, the woman was already far beyond the reach of his influence. What none of them knew, what the buyer would never learn, was that the skiff would be found days later, empty, tied neatly to a cypress root along a bend known only to those who moved quietly through the water. No footprints. No blood. Only a single length of rope, cut clean through. The river kept the rest. And as New Orleans woke to another humid morning, whispers spread faster than facts. They said the woman had vanished. They said the river had taken her. They were wrong. The river had only carried her closer to what she had been moving toward all along. The river delivered her where roads could not. By the second night, she had abandoned the skiff and taken to land, moving through reeds and cypress shadows where insects screamed and the air pressed heavy against the skin. She traveled light. She always had. The things she carried mattered less than what she remembered. Plantations rose from the low country like fortresses pretending to be homes. White columns. Wide verandas. Fields stretching outward, orderly as ledgers. At night, those same places breathed differently. Lamps dimmed. Guards grew lazy. The enslaved moved in quiet currents of their own. Messages passed through gesture and glance. She knew where to go. The first plantation she approached belonged to a man who had not bid openly at the auction but had financed two of the others. His name never appeared on ledgers tied to violence. That was how he preferred it. He believed distance was protection. She watched the place for 2 days, learned the rhythm of patrols, noted where tools were stored, where water was scarce, where fear already lived. On the third night, she made herself visible to the right person. A driver. Older. Scarred. Eyes that had learned when to look away and when not to. "You should not be here," he said when she stepped into the edge of the lamplight. "No," she agreed. "But I am." He studied her face. Recognition stirred, uncertain but persistent. "You came from the river." "Yes." "That means trouble." She tilted her head. "Trouble already lives here." The fire began an hour before dawn. Not wild. Not reckless. It started where sugar dried and spread where water could not reach in time. By the time the bells rang, it had learned the house's bones. Beams cracked. Shingles screamed. Men shouted orders no one could hear over the roar. No one saw who lit it. By morning, half the fields were ash. The owner stood barefoot in the dirt, staring at the ruin, his mouth opening and closing as if words might come back if summoned properly. They did not. News traveled faster than men expected. Within weeks, another plantation burned. Then another. Always connected. Always traceable if one knew where to look. The buyer followed the reports with mounting dread. Each name was familiar. Each loss brushed too close to his own dealings to be ignored. "She is doing this," he said aloud one night, alone in his study. There was no one to argue with him. He hired men. Quiet men. Men who knew how to follow trails others missed. He sent them south, then west, then back toward the city. None returned with answers. Two did not return at all. Meanwhile, the woman moved among people who did not ask for explanations. She traded knowledge for shelter. Names for passage. Sometimes she stayed long enough to leave instructions behind. Sometimes she vanished before anyone thought to wonder where she slept. She never used the same name twice. To some, she was Eliza. To others, Ruth. Once, briefly, she answered to nothing at all. What she carried now was heavier than fear. Was momentum. The quiet man heard of her again in Baton Rouge. A whisper from a dock worker. A rumor from a freed sailor who swore he had seen her standing calm as smoke while men ran. The quiet man smiled for the first time in years. "So she chose fire," he murmured. He had believed she would. He began to move again, following not her footsteps but her effects. The quiet man understood something the buyer did not. That she was not running from anything. She was completing something. Back in New Orleans, the buyer's position weakened. Credit tightened. Friends stopped calling. Invitations ceased. The widow from the auction sent him a note, polite and devastating. Some investments reveal their true cost too late. He burned the note after reading it once. When word came that another man connected to the auction had been found floating face down near the mouth of a bayou, the buyer did not ask for details. He already knew them. Accidents no longer required explanation. He began to drink earlier. He slept less. At night, he dreamed of water rising through his house, soaking paper, lifting ink from pages until nothing remained legible. Far from the city, the woman stood on a low ridge and watched smoke curl into the sky from a place that had once believed itself untouchable. The heat warmed her face. She did not smile. She thought of the names written in oilcloth, of the routes traced in careful hand, of the way men believed control was permanent. Fire had taught her otherwise. What none of them knew, what even the quiet man could not yet see, was that the fires were only the beginning. That she was not dismantling one network, but exposing a pattern. And patterns once seen could not be unseen. By the time the buyer understood that survival was no longer the goal she pursued, it would be far too late to bargain. Because fire moved faster than men. And memory moved faster still. The buyer fled New Orleans before the city could decide whether to protect him or consume him. He told himself it was temporary. A retreat. He left under the pretense of business upriver, settling instead on a plantation that had belonged to his wife's family for generations. It sat high enough to avoid floods, surrounded by cane fields that bent obediently in the wind. He believed elevation meant safety. He had always believed distance could solve things. The quiet man arrived 2 nights later. He came alone, his horse lathered, his coat dusted pale with ash. The buyer recognized him instantly, though they had never spoken directly. Recognition carried no comfort this time. "You should not be here," the buyer said, gripping the rail of the veranda. The quiet man dismounted slowly. "Neither should you." They stood in the heat without greeting, two men bound by a woman neither had managed to own. Somewhere behind the house, enslaved laborers moved quietly, pretending not to see. "You are chasing a ghost," the buyer said. "No," the quiet man replied. "I am following a trail you helped lay." The buyer laughed, thin and sharp. "You think she cares about you? About justice? She is destroying everything she touches." The quiet man's expression did not change. "No, she is revealing it." The first scream came from the fields. It cut through the night like torn cloth. Then another. Shouts followed. Confusion rippled outward, fast and uncontrolled. The buyer spun toward the sound, his breath catching. Fire bloomed at the edge of the cane, sudden and violent. Wind carried it forward, feeding it greedily. The dry stalks ignited as if waiting for the excuse. "She is here," the buyer whispered. The quiet man nodded. "Yes." They ran. The plantation descended into chaos within minutes. Guards scattered. Horses reared. Someone rang the bell too late. Flames leapt from field to outbuilding, licking toward the main house. Smoke rolled thick and blinding. The buyer burst into his study, hands shaking as he tore open drawers. Papers spilled to the floor. Deeds, letters, accounts he had once believed immortal. Outside, glass shattered. Heat pressed against the walls. He heard footsteps behind him and turned, expecting servants or guards. It was her. She stood in the doorway, smoke curling around her like a second skin. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes bright and focused. She carried a lantern in one hand, its flame steady despite the chaos. "You," he breathed. "Yes," she said. "You did this," he accused, backing away. "I finished it," she corrected. He lunged. She moved aside with practiced ease. He stumbled, crashed into the desk. She set the lantern down deliberately, right atop a stack of papers. "You do not understand," he said desperately. "I could have protected you." She watched the flame catch. "You could not even protect yourself." The room filled with smoke. He coughed, staggered toward the door. She did not stop him. She had learned long ago that men destroyed themselves more efficiently when allowed to flee. Outside, the quiet man waited near the riverbank. He saw her emerge from the burning house, silhouetted against the inferno. "It is done," he said. "For him," she replied. "Not for them." They did not touch. They did not linger. She handed him a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Make copies," she said. "Then burn the rest." He nodded, reverent. "And you?" She looked back at the flames consuming the house, the fields, the lie of permanence. "I disappear," she said. By dawn, the plantation was nothing but ash and memory. The buyer's body was found near the river, lungs filled with smoke and water. The official report called it an accident. Tragic. Inevitable. No one mentioned the woman. By the time the sun rose fully, she was already gone, moving through the landscape like a story people would later argue about. Some said she was a ghost. Others said she was a warning. None of them knew how carefully she had planned that night, or how many names still waited to be remembered. By the time the ash cooled, New Orleans had already begun the work of forgetting. The buyer's death was recorded in a narrow column of newsprint, tucked beneath shipping schedules and church notices. "Tragic accident," it read. "A respectable man lost to fire and river." No mention was made of the auction. No mention of the woman. Respectability, like ink, could be guided if one pressed hard enough. The quiet man did not return to the city. He rode north at first light, the oilcloth bundle secured beneath his coat. He stopped only once, at a place where the river narrowed and the banks rose steep, to make copies by lantern glow. He worked carefully, transcribing names, dates, routes. When he finished, he fed the originals to the fire, watching the paper curl and blacken until nothing remained but drifting flakes. Some truths needed many witnesses. Others needed none. In New Orleans, clerks opened ledgers and frowned. Pages were missing. Entire entries had vanished. Where the woman should have appeared, where a price that large should have left a mark, there was nothing. No name. No notation. Just a gap that resisted explanation. One clerk tried to reconstruct the sale from memory. He wrote and crossed out. Wrote again. In the end, he closed the book and locked it away. He would later insist there had never been such a woman. Downriver, a freed sailor told a story in a tavern about a woman who moved like smoke and spoke like someone who had already made peace with consequence. The story changed each time it was told. She gained scars, lost them, became older, younger. Sometimes she carried fire, sometimes water. The sailor was laughed at, then listened to, then ignored. Weeks passed, then months. The widow from the auction sold her holdings and left Louisiana entirely. The judge's family retreated into private grief. The sugar planter from Plaquemines Parish lost 2 more fields to fire and 1 son to fever. Connections that had once felt solid thinned and frayed. Men began to avoid speaking of certain deals aloud. As for the woman, she was seen everywhere and nowhere. A healer matching her description was rumored to have crossed into Texas with a group of runaways. A dockhand in Mobile swore she had paid him in silver and asked about ships bound for Haiti. A priest claimed a woman had come to confession, spoken nothing, and left him shaken without saying why. None of these accounts could be proven. Years later, a census taker would pause over a household in a border town and frown. A woman there answered questions carefully, her accent unplaceable, her history vague. When he asked her name, she smiled politely and gave one he would never remember correctly. History prefers certainty. It dislikes gaps. So the gaps were filled. Scholars later argued that the auction price had been exaggerated, that the deaths were unrelated, that fires were common in Cane country, that women did not orchestrate such things. It was easier to believe in coincidence than intention. Yet the pattern remained, faint but persistent. Where her story should have been, there was silence. Where silence gathered, something else had been erased alongside it. Not just one woman but a network. Routes, profits, agreements that thrived only when unseen. The quiet man died years later in a place far from rivers. Among his belongings, his family found notebooks filled with careful script. Names, dates, arrows drawn between them. They did not understand what they held. They burned the papers, afraid of attracting questions. In doing so, they preserved the mystery. Because what survives longest is not always what is written down. Sometimes it is what people refuse to forget. In New Orleans, long after the auction house on St. Louis Street had changed hands and purpose, someone scratched a small mark into the wood beneath the old platform. It went unnoticed for decades. When renovations finally stripped the room bare, the mark vanished with the rest. No one recorded it. But stories persisted in quieter places. In kitchens, in fields, along riverbanks where people learned to listen before speaking. The story of a woman who had been priced too high to keep and too dangerous to remember. Whether she lived out her days in peace or died nameless on a distant shore, no one could say for certain. What mattered was this. For a brief time, ownership cracked. Ledgers failed. Men who believed themselves untouchable learned otherwise. And somewhere beyond the reach of records, a woman walked free, carrying not vengeance alone but memory. That, more than fire or water, was what frightened them most. Because memory did not disappear. It waited. Time did what it always did in New Orleans. It softened the edges. It rounded the story until it fit comfortably inside denial. Within a decade, the auction house on St. Louis Street no longer sold people. It sold commodities, then furniture, then silence. New paint covered old walls. New owners swore there had never been anything unusual about the place. If pressed, they spoke of exaggerations, drunken tales, northern abolitionist fantasies. The city agreed. Official histories listed the fires as economic misfortune. Weather, poor oversight. They listed the deaths as coincidence. Fever was common. Rivers were dangerous. Men fell. Men drowned. None of it required a woman to explain it, especially not an enslaved one. Records hardened around that version of events. Ledgers survived where memory did not. What little evidence remained was scattered, misfiled, or deliberately mislabeled. One archivist noted that entire sequences of plantation correspondence from the early 1840s simply stopped, as if men had agreed, without writing it down, to stop explaining themselves. That archivist died before finishing his work. In the quarters and kitchens, the story lived differently. It was told without dates. Without names that could be traced. A woman, always a woman, watching, moving between places where she was not supposed to be. Sometimes she carried fire, sometimes knowledge, sometimes nothing at all except the certainty that she had already survived the worst part. Children learned the story in pieces, absorbed between chores. Do not believe what the papers say. Do not think power is permanent. Do not assume silence means absence. Those lessons endured longer than any plantation. By the 1860s, when the world cracked open again and slavery finally staggered toward its end, men searched old records for explanations they could use. They found nothing useful. The woman never appeared. Not in sale books. Not in shipping manifests. Not in death notices. She had become inconvenient to history. Some scholars later argued she had been invented entirely. A myth stitched together from multiple fires, multiple women, multiple grievances. They pointed to the lack of documentation as proof. They trusted the ledgers. What they did not consider was how often ledgers lied. Because lies written down look like truth long enough to replace it. In one private collection, long forgotten until a descendant sold it off piecemeal, a letter surfaced briefly before disappearing again. It was unsigned, undated. It spoke of an auction that should never have happened. Of men who mistook possession for safety. Of a woman who refused to carry the weight of their certainty. The buyer was not named. Neither was she. The letter ended with a single line, written smaller than the rest, almost as an afterthought. She did not destroy us. She simply stopped protecting us from ourselves. The letter vanished into private hands. It was never authenticated. It was never cited. In that way, it joined the story it described. Years later, a freed woman living near the river told a visiting preacher something that unsettled him deeply. He wrote it down once, then crossed it out. She said freedom came to her long before the war, he noted in the margin of his journal. She said it came quietly. I did not ask how. The preacher convinced himself the woman was confused. Romantic. He closed the journal and never returned to that page. And so the lie settled in. That nothing unusual had happened. That no woman had bent the machinery of ownership until it screamed. That power had been surrendered politely by law and war, and not challenged earlier in the dark by someone who refused to wait. History prefers clean endings. This one offered none. Only gaps. Only ash. Only a pattern that emerged briefly and was buried quickly because it frightened the wrong people. And beneath it all, a simple, unbearable truth. That the system was never as strong as it claimed. And that one woman, bought too publicly and erased too completely, had proven it, without ever needing her name to survive. Long after the names involved in the auction had thinned into genealogies and footnotes, long after the plantations had been divided, sold, or swallowed by time, something uneasy remained in the soil. People noticed it in small ways. Cane fields that never quite recovered their yield. Houses that refused to stay occupied. Families that produced no heirs despite careful planning. Nothing dramatic enough to record. Nothing precise enough to argue against. Just absence repeating itself quietly. By the late 19th century, New Orleans had remade itself again. Street names shifted. Buildings were torn down and rebuilt taller, cleaner, less honest. The river kept moving, indifferent as ever. Tourists came and went, marveling at architecture without asking what had been traded to afford it. No marker ever appeared for the woman. There was no grave. No portrait. No name etched into public stone. In official memory, she never existed. Yet her shape remained. In the way certain men avoided discussing the early 1840s. In the way families guarded their papers too carefully. In the way old money in Louisiana learned to fear records as much as rebellions. Somewhere beyond the reach of census and archive, a woman lived out the rest of her life. Or perhaps several women did, each inheriting pieces of the same story. One might have crossed into Mexico. Another might have stayed near the Gulf, passing as free before freedom was lawful. Another might have died quietly, surrounded by people who knew better than to ask where she came from. Whether she survived into old age or disappeared young, no one can say for certain. What mattered was that she changed the arithmetic. She proved that value could turn poisonous. That ownership invited attention. That buying a human being too openly could fracture the illusion that kept the system safe. The men who survived learned different lessons. Some grew cautious. Some grew crueler. Some simply pretended nothing had happened and relied on the future to forget for them. For a time it worked. Then the war came. Then the system collapsed publicly. Then men insisted they had always known it would. But some truths arrive early, carried by people history would rather ignore. In kitchens and back rooms, the story continued to be told, not as revenge but as instruction. Not as legend but as warning. Do not mistake silence for submission. Do not assume control is permanent. Do not believe that ledgers capture everything that matters. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in a system built on ownership is not rebellion. It is memory. And memory, once awakened, does not require permission to move. Years later, when historians argued about dates and causes, when scholars dismissed the fires as coincidence and the deaths as unrelated, they were correct about one thing. There was no proof. Proof requires cooperation. And the woman had ensured there would be none. What survived instead was something harder to erase. A pattern glimpsed briefly, then hidden. A question without a neat answer. A story that refused to sit still long enough to be contained. The impossible secret of the most coveted female slave ever auctioned in New Orleans was not how she escaped. It was how completely she vanished, not into death, but into freedom that left no receipt behind. And that, more than any fire, more than any body pulled from the river, was what frightened them most. Because systems can rebuild after destruction, but they cannot defend against someone who leaves nothing for them to reclaim. What do you think really happened to her? Did she disappear by design, or was she protected by something larger than herself? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more dark historical mysteries like this, stories history tried to bury, subscribe to Chronicles of Shadows, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who understands that the past is never as quiet as it pretends to be. These stories need to be remembered. These voices need to be heard.